It all started with a single drop of oil, a pathetic, quarter-sized Rorschach test on my otherwise immaculate driveway, left behind by the Domino's kid whose 2003 Civic sounded more like a bag of angry hornets than a car. To me, it was nothing. A tiny, insignificant blemish on the vast gray canvas of suburban life. A testament to a pizza well earned. To the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, however, it was the first horseman of the apocalypse. That's how I found myself standing on my perfectly manicured lawn on a Saturday morning so beautiful it felt photoshopped, holding a piece of paper that radiated pure, passive-aggressive energy. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and entitlement. The synchronized hiss of a dozen sprinkler systems formed a gentle, mocking chorus. This was the suburban dream, and I had just received its eviction notice. The envelope was aggressively beige, made of a cardstock thick enough to stop a low-caliber bullet. The HOA logo, a single, sterile maple leaf inside a perfect circle, was embossed in the corner. It looked like the branding for a cult that worshipped lawn maintenance. I'd lived here for 2 years, a freelance web designer seeking peace, quiet, and reliable fiber internet. I kept to myself, paid my dues on time, and brought my trash cans in a full hour before the deadline. I was a model citizen, a ghost in the suburban machine, but my ghost was about to get busted. I tore it open. The letter inside was a masterpiece of corporate speak, designed to make you feel like you'd committed a federal crime. Official notice of violation, #227B, Dear resident of 114 Willow Lane. This letter serves as a formal notice that your property has been found in violation of the Maple Creek Estates Community Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and Rs. During a routine community inspection on Friday, September 5th, 2025, a member of the Architectural Control Committee noted the following infraction. Violation of Article 4, Section 8. B. Driveways and paved surfaces must be maintained in a clean, presentable, and fluid stain-free condition. There it was, in cold, dead Times New Roman. I was a fluid stainer, a driveway deviant. The letter continued, its tone growing increasingly ominous, but the real kicker was at the bottom. Taped neatly to the page was a photograph. A glossy 4x6 high-resolution color photo of the oil stain. It was taken from a low angle, probably from across the street, with a telephoto lens that made the tiny black spot look like a meteor crater. They had photographic evidence of my transgression. I half expected to see a tiny yellow evidence marker next to it. A fine of $50 was to be paid within 14 days. Failure to remediate the offending stain and remit payment would result in further sanctions. I didn't know what further sanctions entailed, but I imagined it involved a public shaming at the community pool or being forced to listen to a looped recording of the HOA president's welcome speech. Speaking of the devil, across the street, Brenda Mayhew was tending to her petunias. Brenda was the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s whose blonde hair was sculpted into a helmet so rigid it was rumored to have its own property value. She moved with the stiff, purposeful gait of someone who has never once in her life questioned if she was in the right. She looked up from her flowers, her eyes zeroing in on me from 100 feet away. She gave me a smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a thin, tight-lipped, knowing smile. The smile of a predator who has just watched its prey walk into a carefully laid trap. I sighed, the crisp morning air feeling suddenly heavy. This was ridiculous. It was a drop of oil. I folded the letter, a declaration of war printed on beige paper, and walked across the street. This could be handled with a simple, reasonable conversation between two adults. I had no idea how wrong I was. "Morning, Brenda," I said, trying to keep my tone light and neighborly. She straightened up, wiping a non-existent speck of dirt from her gardening gloves. "Leo, it's a beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect for routine property maintenance." Her eyes flicked down to the letter in my hand. "Yeah, about that," I said, holding it up. "I got your little fan mail. A bit intense for a drop of oil from the pizza guy, don't you think?" Brenda's smile didn't waver, but it somehow got colder. "The bylaws are the bedrock of our community's property values, Leo," she said, her voice calm and even, the kind of voice that could inform you your house was on fire with the same inflection she'd use to order a coffee. "They ensure a harmonious living environment for everyone. We can't have exceptions. An oil stain today, a car on blocks tomorrow. It's a slippery slope." "It's asphalt, Brenda. The whole thing is a slippery slope. Can't I just, I don't know, ignore it? It'll probably fade by winter." "Your notice has a 14-day compliance period," she replied, completely ignoring my question. She turned back to a petunia, gently plucking a leaf. The conversation was over. "Have a lovely day." I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded. It wasn't about the stain. It wasn't about property values. It was about control, about the quiet, tyrannical pleasure of enforcing meaningless rules. I walked back to my own driveway, the battlefield, and stared down at the tiny black spot. It stared back, mocking me. 14 days. The clock was ticking. The war had begun. My war on the stain began with the misplaced optimism of a man who still believed in reason. My weapon of choice? A bottle of Dawn dish soap and a scrub brush I'd bought for cleaning tire rims. The internet, that boundless font of questionable advice, swore this was the answer. I descended upon the stain like a vengeful god, squirting a comical amount of blue soap onto the asphalt and scrubbing with a fury that would have made my gym trainer proud. The result was a mountain of suds that threatened to engulf my entire driveway. It looked like I was giving my house a bubble bath. After 10 minutes of frantic scrubbing and a thorough rinse with the garden hose, the suds cleared to reveal my handiwork. The stain was lighter, but it was also about 5 times larger. I had succeeded only in smearing the oil into a ghostly, greasy smear the size of a dinner plate. It now looked less like an accidental drip and more like the faint outline of a recently deceased squirrel. This was not an improvement. My next attempt came courtesy of a different online forum, one that suggested kitty litter. Apparently, the clay's absorbent properties could pull the oil right out of the porous asphalt. It sounded scientific enough. I drove to the pet store and bought a 10-pound bag of Clump and Seal, feeling utterly ridiculous. Back home, I poured a generous mound of the stuff onto the greasy smear, forming a small, gray pyramid on my driveway. I was supposed to let it sit for 24 hours. I stood back, looking at the pile of cat litter, and thought, this is my life now. I am a grown man fighting a grease spot with feline toilet supplies. The next morning, I went out to check on it, only to find that my scientific experiment had acquired a new variable. A fat, ginger tabby cat, one I'd never seen before, was just finishing its business right on top of the pile. It looked up at me, blinked slowly as if to say, "What? It's for this, right?" And then sauntered off, leaving me with a problem that was now significantly more organic. After disposing of the compromised kitty litter with a shovel and a biohazard bag, I knew I had to escalate. It was time to bring in the big guns. At the hardware store, I found a product called Grease Be Gone 9000. It came in a black, plastic bottle with a skull and crossbones on the label and a list of warnings longer than my mortgage agreement. The guy at the counter, a grizzled old man with a name tag that just said Stan, looked at the bottle and then at me. "You got a body to dissolve?" he asked. "Just an oil stain," I said. "Same difference," he grunted, ringing me up. "Don't get this on your skin or your lawn. Or anything you're fond of, really. Feeling like a mad scientist, I applied a small amount of grease-begone 9000 to the stain. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The asphalt began to fizzle, a tiny wisp of acrid smoke rising into the air. It smelled like a chemical weapons factory. I let it sit for the prescribed 60 seconds, my heart pounding, then blasted it with the hose from a safe distance. The result was breathtaking. The oil stain was completely, utterly gone, vanished without a trace. In its place, however, was a perfect, bone-white circle bleached directly into the blacktop. It was like the driveway had seen a ghost. I had traded a subtle, noirish blemish for a screamingly loud albino crop circle. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," I muttered, staring at the pristine white scar on my driveway. It was 10 times more conspicuous than the original stain. Brenda must have had motion-activated cameras trained on my property, because the next letter arrived the very next day. This one was personally placed in my mailbox, not even entrusted to the U.S. Postal Service. The tone had shifted from formal warning to outright threat. Final notice of violation. #314A. Dear resident of 114 Willow Lane, your failure to properly remediate the initial violation, #227B, has resulted in a new, more serious infraction. Unauthorized application of corrosive agents resulting in severe surface discoloration. Your fine has been increased to $150. Per Article 4, Section 8C, you are now required to resurface the entire affected area to maintain aesthetic uniformity. You have 7 days to provide the board with a contractor's estimate and a project timeline. Failure to comply will result in a daily penalty of $25 and the potential filing of a lien against your property. We trust this clarifies the matter. Resurface the whole thing. A project that would cost thousands of dollars. All because of a single drop of oil. I stood on my driveway, the threatening letter trembling in my hand, staring at the bleached white circle of my failure. All my attempts to comply, to be a good little soldier in Brenda's suburban army, had only made things worse. I had followed the rules, and this was my reward. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, angry snap. It was a quiet, cold, and profoundly liberating one. I started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle, then grew into a full-blown, slightly maniacal laugh that echoed across the perfectly manicured lawns of Maple Creek Estates. I was done playing their game. That night sleep was impossible. My mind was racing, buzzing with righteous indignation. I fired up my PlayStation looking for a distraction. I loaded up a racing game, my digital Porsche screaming around the track at Nürburgring. I took a corner too fast, the tires squealing, leaving perfect black skid marks on the virtual asphalt as I drifted through the turn. I paused the game. My eyes drifted to the window, to the pale white circle on my driveway, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I looked back at the TV screen, the starting grid, the rumble strips, the pit lane, the glorious checkered finish line. It was also uniform, so aesthetically pleasing in its own way. A perfectly designed system of lines and markings, all with a purpose. A system where stains and skid marks weren't violations. They were features. They were part of the art. Aesthetic uniformity, I whispered to myself, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across my face. Oh, I'd give Brenda aesthetic uniformity. I was going to give her a masterpiece. The next 48 hours were a blur of creative fury. My freelance projects were forgotten. My email inbox overflowed with unanswered client requests. I was a man possessed by a vision. My target wasn't a client's homepage. It was my own driveway. My tool wasn't Photoshop. It was spite. As a designer, if I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. This couldn't just be a few spray-painted lines. It had to be a work of art, an act of malicious compliance so beautiful and so thorough that it would transcend pettiness and achieve a state of suburban legend. I started with Google Earth, getting a perfect top-down satellite image of my property. I imported it into my design software, tracing the exact dimensions of my L-shaped driveway. Most suburban driveways are boringly functional. Mine, with its slight curve toward the two-car garage, had potential. It had flow. I decided against copying a real-world track. This had to be an original design, a bespoke circuit. I christened it the Circuit de la Willow Lane. I spent hours perfecting the layout. A long front straightaway from the sidewalk to the house, a challenging hairpin turn near the mailbox, a fast, sweeping corner around the prize-winning rose bush my mother had planted, and a final chicane before the finish line, which I placed directly in front of my garage door. The details were everything. I designed a proper starting grid with numbered positions. I added red and white rumble strips to the apex of each corner. The space next to my garden hose and outdoor faucet became the designated pit stop, complete with a perfectly stenciled box. The bleached white circle, the source of all this madness. That became the centerpiece. I designed a spectacular, hyper-realistic burnout and crash scene around it, with intricate, overlapping skid marks fanning out in a glorious arc, as if a race car had just spun out in a cloud of smoke. The original, offending oil stain would be lovingly preserved, just another piece of authentic track grit. For the final touch, I added sponsor logos, tiny stenciled decals for brands that defined my life. Domino's Pizza got prime placement near the first turn. Grease Be Gone 9000 was immortalized in the center of the burnout. I even added the logo of my favorite local coffee shop, The Daily Grind, along the main straight. When I was done, I printed out a full-color, large-format blueprint. It was magnificent, it was absurd, it was perfect. Now I just needed someone crazy enough to help me build it. I knew I couldn't do this with a few cans of Rust-Oleum. It required professional-grade thermoplastic paint, the kind they use for road markings. It needed to be durable. It needed to be official. I started calling commercial line painting companies. The first call was a disaster. I was connected to a cheerful receptionist at a huge corporate outfit called Precision Pavement Solutions. "Hi there," I began, trying to sound normal. "I'm looking to get a quote on a decorative line painting project for a residential driveway." "Certainly, sir. Are you looking for a basketball key? A hopscotch grid, perhaps?" "Not exactly," I said. "I'm thinking more along the lines of a fully marked 1/12 scale racetrack." There was a long, confused silence on the other end. A racetrack, sir?" "Yes, with a starting grid, rumble strips, the works." "Is this for a commercial go-kart facility?" "Nope. Standard suburban driveway." "Sir," she said, her voice now laced with suspicion, "do you have the proper municipal permits for a private speedway?" Before I could answer, she said, "I don't think we can help you." And the line went dead. My second call went a little better, if only because they laughed for a solid minute before hanging up on me. I was beginning to lose hope when I found a listing on a dusty corner of the internet for Sal's Striping and Staining. The website looked like it was designed in 1998, but the gallery showed some impressive, unconventional work: intricate compass roses on patios, custom logos on warehouse floors. I dialed the number. A voice that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer answered on the second ring. "Sal's." "Hi, Sal. My name is Leo. I have a decorative concrete staining project. It's a bit unconventional. Kid, I've painted a giant squid on the bottom of a pool and a full-scale Sistine Chapel ceiling on a garage floor. Try me." I took a deep breath and explained my vision. I told him about the HOA, the fines, the bleached circle, and my grand design for the Circuit de la Willow Lane. When I finished, There was a long, thoughtful pause on the other end of the line. I thought he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke. "You're doing this to stick it to your HOA, aren't you?" A wave of relief washed over me. He got it. "Is it that obvious?" I could hear a low chuckle. "Kid, 90% of my residential jobs are motivated by spite. It's the foundation of the American suburbs. I'll be there tomorrow at 8, cash only. And I'm charging you a spite tax. It's an extra 15% for jobs I find personally enjoyable." "Deal," I said without hesitation. Sal arrived the next morning in a battered Ford F-250 that looked like it had survived a war. He was a man in his 60s, built like a fire hydrant, with a thick gray mustache and hands stained with a rainbow of ancient paints. He was flanked by his two-man crew, a pair of quiet, muscular guys who looked like they communicated exclusively through grunts and head nods. I unrolled the blueprints on the hood of his truck. Sal studied them intently, a professional gleam in his eye. He traced the hairpin turn with a calloused finger. "Nice. Good apex. You're going to get some serious big-wheel understeer on this corner." "That's the idea," I said. "All right, kid, I'm in," he declared. "But we gotta do this quiet. We don't want the dragon lady across the street seeing what we're up to." The plan was simple. We'd use my garage as a staging area and erect large, opaque tarps on a scaffolding frame around the entire driveway. To the outside world, it would look like a standard, boring resurfacing job. Brenda would see the tarps, assume I was complying, and leave us alone. She'd get the surprise of her life on reveal day. For the next 2 days, my driveway was a covert operations center. Sal and his crew were artists. They started by pressure washing and prepping the entire surface. Then, with a quiet hum, their specialized line painting machine began to lay down the crisp, white lines of the track. Sal, it turned out, was a savant with an airbrush. He took personal responsibility for the crash site. I watched, mesmerized, as he transformed the bleached white circle into a breathtakingly realistic scene of automotive chaos. He layered shades of black and gray to create the skid marks, using a heavy-duty heat gun to bake them into the asphalt. "An oil stain's gotta look earned, kid," he growled at me, as he meticulously airbrushed a few extra drips and splatters near the pit stop. "It needs character. It needs a backstory. This one here," he said, pointing to a fresh black splotch. "This is from a leaky gasket on a '72 Chevelle. You can feel the history." I played the role of anxious creative director, running back and forth from my office with my laptop to ensure every curve and logo matched my original design. We worked late into the night, the driveway illuminated by powerful work lamps, the whole scene hidden behind the blue tarps. We were a secret society of spite, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a dozen boxes of pizza, delivered to the back door, of course. By the end of the second day, it was finished. We stood back in the dim light of the garage, looking at our creation. It was more glorious than I could have ever imagined. It was a perfect, pristine, professional-grade racetrack, a ribbon of beautiful absurdity laid over the canvas of my suburban driveway. Sal clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow morning," he said, a rare grin splitting his mustache, "you pull down those tarps, and you show the world our masterpiece." Monday morning arrived with the kind of cinematic perfection you couldn't script. The sun was bright, the sky was a cloudless, brilliant blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the maple trees that gave our neighborhood its name. It was the perfect day for a revolution. After Sal and his crew had cleared out their equipment under the cover of darkness, I began my preparations. This wasn't just a reveal, it was a performance. I wheeled my nephew's little red big wheel out of the garage and placed it precisely on the pole position of the starting grid. I found an old checkered flag from a Halloween costume and propped it up against the garage door, right at the finish line. The pièce de résistance was an old motorcycle helmet I owned. I put it on, flipped down the visor, and settled into a lawn chair I'd placed strategically on the grass next to the track. With a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, I was ready. I was the Grand Marshal of my own Grand Prix. With a deep, satisfying breath, I walked over to the scaffolding and untied the first rope. The heavy blue tarp slid down its frame with a loud whoosh, revealing the first section of the front straight away. I moved down the line, untying each rope in succession. Tarp after tarp fell away, and the Circuit de la Willow Lane was revealed to the world in all its magnificent, petty glory. The first person to see it was Gary, Brenda's husband. Gary was a meek, perpetually hunched-over accountant whose entire existence seemed to be an apology. He emerged from his front door to fetch the morning paper, dressed in a gray robe that matched his gray complexion. He took 3 steps onto his lawn, then froze mid-stride. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open, the paper slipping from his grasp. He stared at my driveway, his brain visibly struggling to process the scene. The big wheel on the starting grid. The checkered flag. The man in the motorcycle helmet calmly sipping coffee. He looked from my driveway to me, back to the driveway. Without a word, he slowly backed away, fumbled with his front door, and disappeared inside. I considered that a small victory. The next reaction was far more gratifying. Mark, my neighbor from 2 doors down, was heading to his car for work. Mark was a cool, laid-back guy in his 30s who worked as a sound engineer. He stopped, did a classic double-take, and then his face broke into a massive grin. A loud, booming laugh echoed across the quiet street. "No way," he yelled, jogging over. "Leo, you magnificent bastard. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." He pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures. "The HOA is going to have an aneurysm. This is art." He gave me a fist bump before getting in his car, still laughing. But this was just the opening act. The headliner was about to take the stage. Brenda's front door flew open with such force it rattled against its frame. She stormed out onto her porch, wearing a fluffy pink robe and clutching a cordless phone to her ear, like it was a lifeline. She was mid-sentence, probably reporting a rogue garden gnome to the HOA hotline when she saw it. Her entire body went rigid. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the porch. Her face was a brilliant, theatrical cascade of emotions. First, a slack-jawed confusion, as if she was seeing an alien spacecraft. Then, a flicker of disbelief, her eyes blinking rapidly as if to clear the image. And finally, her features curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her face turned a shade of crimson that clashed horribly with her pink robe. "Leo!" The shriek was so high-pitched I worried it might shatter windows. She stomped across her perfect lawn and onto the sidewalk, pointing a trembling finger at my driveway. "What have you done?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, then raised my visor. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, my voice infuriatingly calm. "Just resurfacing the driveway per your notice. I was concerned about maintaining aesthetic uniformity." "You like it?" I was going for a classic Monza feel, but with a more intimate, suburban vibe. "This is not uniform!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. This is a monstrosity, a desecration. It's a violation of everything." "On the contrary," I said, getting up from my chair and walking towards her, adopting the tone of a museum docent. "It's a highly uniform pattern. See how the lines are crisp? The colors are consistent throughout. And if you'll check the bylaws, I believe it's Section C, Paragraph 4, it clearly states that decorative concrete staining is permissible. It says nothing, and I've checked, about the specific pattern one might choose. Brenda was sputtering. She was a creature of rules and regulations, and I had just used her own holy scripture against her. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd met her, she was utterly, completely speechless. She just stood there, vibrating with a rage for which there were no words. Finally, she let out a strangled gasp, spun on her heel, and stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard that one of her prize-winning petunias in a hanging basket dropped to the porch. The aftermath of the unveiling was swift. My driveway became an instant local attraction. The neighborhood, once a placid sea of beige, was now sharply divided. The older, stuffier residents would slow their morning walks as they passed my house, shaking their heads and muttering about the decline of civilization. But the others loved it. The younger families were overwhelmingly on my side. By that afternoon, the revolution had begun. Kids started showing up with their bikes and scooters, lining up at the starting grid to have races on the track. Their parents would watch from the sidewalk, giving me discreet thumbs-ups and nods of approval. Mark came back from work and immediately brought over a high-end remote-controlled car, gleefully drifting it around the hairpin turn. My driveway, once a simple slab of asphalt, had become an unlikely community hub, a symbol of rebellion against the tyranny of beige, and I, the quiet web designer, was its reluctant king. Brenda's defeat on the battlefield of my front lawn was only temporary. She was a woman who, when faced with a problem she couldn't solve through sheer force of will, simply escalated to a higher authority. Having failed to intimidate me with the holy book of CC and Rs, she did what any cornered tyrant would do. She called the cops. I was in the middle of a conference call, trying to explain to a client why their new website logo shouldn't be entirely composed of glitter GIFs, when I saw the flashing lights pull up to the curb. A police cruiser from the Maple Creek PD had arrived. My heart did a little tap dance against my ribs. Okay, Leo, this is it. Don't panic. Tacky is not illegal. 2 officers got out. One was young, with a fresh-from-the-academy haircut and an earnest, by-the-book expression. His name tag read Evans. The other was older, probably in his late 50s, with a weary posture that suggested he'd seen every form of human stupidity imaginable and was profoundly unimpressed by all of it. His name tag was Miller. Sergeant Miller. Brenda was already on them, practically dragging them by their sleeves toward my driveway and pointing at it as if it were a chalk outline. "There! Look at it!" she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured victimhood. "He has vandalized his own property. It's a public nuisance. It's an attractive nuisance. It will attract hooligans." I ended my conference call and walked outside, trying to project an aura of calm, responsible citizenship. "Is there a problem, officers?" Sergeant Miller's eyes scanned the scene. He took in the perfect white lines, the painted rumble strips, the pit stop box, the elaborate burnout mark. He looked at the big wheel still parked on the starting grid. He looked at me. Then he looked at a frantic Brenda. A tiny muscle in his cheek twitched. I could have sworn he was fighting back a smile. "Ma'am, you called 911 for this?" Miller asked, his voice a gravelly deadpan. "Of course. This is a deliberate provocation. It lowers property values. It's visual pollution," Brenda insisted. Miller ignored her and walked onto the driveway, inspecting my handiwork like an art critic. He crouched down to look at one of the fake sponsor logos. "The Daily Grind," he read aloud. "Good coffee there." He stood up and turned to me. "This is elaborate." "I'm a designer," I said with a shrug. "I believe in a thorough execution of a concept." "And the concept is?" "Malicious compliance," I said. Evans, the younger officer, was flipping through a small notepad, looking confused. "I'm not seeing a specific municipal code violation for, excessive driveway decoration. That's because there isn't one, Miller said, turning back to Brenda. Ma'am, with all due respect, there's no law against tacky. As long as it's not obscene, as long as he's not blocking the sidewalk or creating a public traffic hazard, he can paint his driveway purple with pink polka dots if he wants to. It's his property. But, Brenda sputtered. We're not the taste police, Miller said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Please don't call this number again unless there's an actual crime being committed. Have a good day. He tipped his cap to me, and the two officers got back in their cruiser and drove away. I watched them go, a massive grin spreading across my face. It was a total victory. Brenda stood on the sidewalk, defeated and fuming, her ultimate weapon having proven to be a dud. The story, however, was just getting started. Mark, my supportive neighbor, had posted the photos he'd taken to the official Maple Creek Community Facebook page. The post was titled, "My neighbor is a legend. The HOA is not happy." It went viral. At least Maple Creek viral. Within hours, it had hundreds of reactions and comments. The sentiment was overwhelmingly on my side. OMG, this is the hero we need. I lived under Brenda's reign for 10 years. This brings a tear to my eye. Is he single? Asking for a friend who is also me. My HOA fined me because my garbage can was visible from the street for 2 hours. I feel this in my soul. The post was shared, then shared again. It was picked up by a popular regional blog, and from there it reached the local news. On Tuesday afternoon, a van with the Channel 8 News logo on the side pulled up in front of my house. A reporter with impossibly white teeth and a cameraman in tow walked up my driveway, my racetrack, and knocked on my door. "Leo?" the reporter asked. "I'm Jessica Finch with Channel 8. We heard about your unique approach to landscaping. Do you have a minute to talk?" I did. I stood proudly on my front porch. The Circuit de la Willow Lane, a beautiful backdrop behind me. I gave Jessica the whole story, deadpan and serious. I showed her the original violation letter with the creepy photo of the oil stain. I explained my failed attempts at compliance, and then I laid out my artistic vision. The HOA demanded aesthetic uniformity, I said, looking directly into the camera. I believe what you see behind me is the very definition of a uniform aesthetic. It's a closed-loop system designed for peak performance. The suburbs can feel a little restrictive, and I just wanted to introduce a space dedicated to speed, freedom, and the occasional, well-executed handbrake turn. The segment aired that night on the 6 o'clock news. They framed it perfectly, a classic David versus Goliath story, the little guy against the big bad HOA. They interspersed my interview with shots of Brenda marching back into her house and slamming the door, and wonderful B-roll footage of neighborhood kids gleefully racing their scooters around the track. They even interviewed Mark. "Leo's a hero," he said, grinning into the camera. "He's striking a blow for anyone who's ever been told their basketball hoop is a non-approved color." My phone started blowing up with texts from friends and family across the state who'd seen the story. My driveway was famous. I was the face of a tiny, asphalt-based rebellion. The stakes had been raised to a level I had never imagined, and I knew with absolute certainty that Brenda Mayhew was not going to take this public humiliation lying down. She was cornered, she was furious, and she was about to go nuclear. The public humiliation on Channel 8 News was the final straw. For Brenda and the HOA board, this was no longer about an oil stain or a painted driveway. It was about re-establishing their authority. It was about crushing the rebellion before it could spread. 2 days after the news segment aired, a certified letter arrived. It felt heavier, more menacing than the previous notices. This wasn't a warning. It was a summons. The HOA was calling an emergency executive meeting. The agenda? My driveway. I was formally summoned to appear before the board to answer for a litany of new, creatively interpreted violations. My racetrack was no longer just a violation of the fluid stain-free clause. Now it was being charged as violation #501, creation of an attractive nuisance. Apparently, neighborhood children finding joy on my property was a liability. Violation #502, non-conforming surface patterning. A wonderfully vague catch-all. Violation #503, failure to maintain a subdued and harmonious neighborhood aesthetic. My personal favorite. Violation #504, unapproved alteration resulting in significant public spectacle and media attention detrimental to the community's reputation. They were actually blaming me for them being on the news. The letter concluded with their ultimate threat. If the board voted against me, they would hire a contractor to sandblast my driveway back to its original state, bill me for the exorbitant cost, and, if I refused to pay, place a lien on my house. This was the nuclear option. They were coming for my home. The meeting was held on a Thursday night at the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. I walked in to find the room already packed. It was like a political rally. On one side, my supporters, Mark and the other younger families, a few older folks who were clearly fed up with Brenda's regime, all giving me encouraging smiles and thumbs-ups. On the other side, Brenda's loyalists, a collection of grim-faced, cardigan-wearing residents who looked at me as if I had personally set fire to the flag. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the 5 members of the HOA board. Brenda was in the center, her face a stony mask of grim satisfaction. To her right sat the board's lawyer, a smug, weaselly man named Todd in a suit that was at least one size too big for him. He kept adjusting his tie, a little smirk playing on his lips. He was the hired gun they'd brought in to finish me off. Brenda banged a small gavel. This emergency meeting of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association is now in session. We are here to address the flagrant and ongoing violations at 114 Willow Lane. She gave a dramatic, impassioned speech about the importance of rules and order. She spoke of the sacred covenant they all entered into when they bought their homes. She painted me as a reckless anarchist, a chaos agent sent to destroy their peaceful suburban utopia, one painted line at a time. It was a masterful performance. Then she turned the floor over to Todd the lawyer. Todd stood up, shuffled some papers, and launched into a presentation filled with legalese. He cited obscure clauses and subsections, building a seemingly airtight case. He argued that the word decorative in the bylaws was clearly intended to mean subtle, stamped patterns like faux cobblestone, not a gaudy, full-scale replica of a speedway. He claimed the media attention had caused quantifiable harm to the community's image. He concluded by stating that the board had every legal right to forcibly remove my unapproved alteration and bill me for it. The mood in the room shifted. My supporters looked nervous. Brenda's faction looked smug. I could feel the tide turning against me. Brenda looked at me, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Mr. Leo, do you have anything to say in your defense?" "I do," I said, standing up. I hadn't brought a lawyer. I had brought my laptop and a small projector. I connected my laptop to the projector, and the screen behind the board flickered to life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, residents of Maple Creek," I began, "I am not an anarchist. I am a homeowner who received a $50 fine for a quarter-sized oil stain. Everything that has happened since has been a direct result of that. You accuse me of failing to maintain a subdued and harmonious aesthetic. Let's explore that, shall we?" Click. My first slide appeared. It was a photo of a driveway 3 streets over, which had a basketball key painted on it in faded, peeling yellow paint. Is this subdued and harmonious, Or is it simply an older, more accepted violation? Click. The next slide showed a house with a huge, kitschy welcome mat painted directly onto the front porch concrete in bright, cheerful colors. Is this not a non-conforming surface pattern? Click. My next slide was a close-up of the curb in front of Brenda's own house. She had her address numbers stenciled on in a flowery, cursive font, complete with little painted ivy vines twirling around them. Is this font, Brenda, part of the approved harmonious aesthetic, or is it an unapproved alteration? A murmur went through the room. Brenda's face tightened. Todd the lawyer stood up. Objection, this is irrelevant. I'm just establishing a pattern, I said calmly. A pattern of selective enforcement. But you are right. Let's get to the truly relevant part. Click. I brought up a scanned page from the original HOA charter, a document from 1986 that I had spent 2 days digging up from the county's online records. I had read every single page, every amendment, every dusty bylaw. I'd like to draw your attention to Amendment 14C, added in 1988. I used my laser pointer to highlight a paragraph. It was created, as I understand it, to accommodate a local sculptor who lived on Oak Street at the time. It states, and I quote, "Any homeowner may designate one singular, non-structural exterior feature of their property as a work of registered art. Such a designated feature shall be exempt from standard aesthetic guidelines as outlined in Article 4, provided it poses no safety hazard to the resident or the public." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. The board members were leaning forward, squinting at the screen. Brenda looked utterly bewildered. The amendment further states that the designation must be officially filed with the county. It has never been repealed. Todd the lawyer scoffed. That's absurd. It's an archaic loophole. You can't just call your driveway art. Can't I? I said, reaching into my satchel. Because I did. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the overhead projector. It was a form from the Alexandria County Clerk's office, dated 2 days prior. At the top, it read, "Official Registration of Artistic Work." And in the space for the title, in my neatest print, were the words, "Asphalt Absurdity." It was stamped, signed, and notarized. The room erupted. My supporters burst into applause and laughter. Mark was yelling, "Checkmate!" Brenda looked like she had seen a ghost. Todd the lawyer was flipping frantically through his own copy of the bylaws, his smug confidence completely gone. This is an outrage," Brenda stammered. "It's the rules," I said, echoing her own words back to her. "The bylaws are the bedrock of our community. We can't have exceptions. It's a slippery slope." Brenda, defeated, banged her gavel. "We will vote," she declared, her voice cracking. "The motion is to find the resident of 114 Willow Lane in violation and to authorize the board to remediate the property at the owner's expense. All in favor?" All 5 board members and the rest of Brenda's faction raised their hands. It was a terrifying number. "All opposed?" My heart pounded. I raised my hand. Mark's hand shot up. So did his wife's. One by one, hands went up all across my side of the room. The families with kids, the older gentleman who had always hated the rule about hedge height, the quiet woman who had been fined for having a pink flamingo. It was more than I expected. A board member counted the hands, then counted again. He whispered the tally to Brenda. Her face, already pale, went completely white. She looked out at the sea of defiant faces. The vote was 22 in favor, 25 opposed. The motion had failed. I had won. The fallout from the meeting was immediate and glorious. Brenda's iron-fisted reign over Maple Creek Estates was shattered. Publicly defeated by an archaic loophole and a notarized art form, her authority evaporated overnight. She had built her power on the idea that she was the infallible interpreter of the sacred bylaws, and I had used those same bylaws to prove her wrong in front of the entire community. She didn't even wait for the next official election. A week later, a curt email went out to all homeowners announcing her resignation from the HOA presidency and the board, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The rumor was that Gary, her husband, had finally put his foot down. I saw him a few days later, watering their lawn. He caught my eye from across the street, and for the first time since I'd moved in, gave me a genuine, unforced smile and a quick nod. It was the look of a liberated man. As expected, Mark, my sound engineer neighbor and co-conspirator, was overwhelmingly elected as the new HOA president. His first official act was to propose the Rule of Reasonableness Amendment, a simple one-page document stating that the board should consider intent and circumstance before levying fines, and that no violation under $100 could be issued without a verbal, neighbor-to-neighbor conversation first. It passed almost unanimously. The dark age of beige tyranny was over. My driveway, meanwhile, achieved legendary status. Asphalt absurdity became a legitimate local landmark. People on their way to the grocery store would make a small detour down Willow Lane just to see it. I'd occasionally look out my window and see a car parked at the curb, a family taking a selfie with the starting line in the background. I even got a few strange freelance requests from people in other neighborhoods, asking for a quote to design a rebellious patio or a spite-fueled garden path. I politely declined. My work in the medium of malicious compliance was done. But the best part wasn't the victory or the local fame. It was the change in the neighborhood itself. The racetrack, born of conflict, had become a point of connection. It was a conversation starter. It was a shared joke. It had injected a bit of personality and color into our cookie-cutter world. A few months later, on a warm Saturday evening in early summer, that change was on full display. What started as a few kids having a big wheel race on the track had organically morphed into a full-blown, impromptu neighborhood block party. Someone had rolled a grill out onto the pit stop and was flipping burgers. Music was playing from a portable speaker. Adults were sitting in a motley collection of lawn chairs on my front yard, laughing and talking, while a dozen kids took turns racing down the driveway. I was leaning against my garage, a cold beer in my hand, watching the scene unfold, when a familiar, battered F-250 pulled up. Sal got out, holding a case of beer. "Heard there was a race on," he said, his mustache crinkling into a grin as he surveyed the happy chaos. "Figured I'd come see my masterpiece in action." I handed him a beer. "Couldn't have done it without you, Sal." He took a long sip, looking at the kids racing their scooters over the rumble strips he'd so carefully painted. "You know," he said, his gravelly voice softer than usual, "for a job born out of pure, unadulterated spite, it turned out pretty damn good." "The best things in life usually are, Sal," I said, clinking my bottle against his. "The best things usually are." We stood there for a while in comfortable silence, watching the party. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the houses. The air was filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of children's laughter. It was the picture of suburban harmony, not the sterile, forced harmony Brenda had tried to enforce, but something real and messy and alive. I looked down at the absurd, beautiful, officially registered work of art that was my driveway. It started with a single drop of oil, an insignificant stain that represented everything I disliked about this place, the petty rules, the obsession with a flawless facade. But by fighting it, by refusing to just quietly paint over the problem, I had found something I never expected. I never set out to be a rebel or a community leader. I just didn't want to pay a $50 fine. But in the process, I'd discovered that sometimes the only rational response to absurdity is to embrace even greater absurdity. And sometimes, the best way to build a community is to give it something to rally around, or in this case, something to race on. For the first time since I'd moved in, Maple Creek Estates truly felt like home.